In this final segment on monopsony, I'd like to take a look at labor's profit and think about mobility costs. Now, a moment ago, or in the prior segment, I gave you a brief glimpse into profits or labor's profit within monopsony. Let's start by looking at this model, assuming that we were a competitive market and we're relying on these equations of labor supply and labor demand. Well, we know that in that market, we would have a employer surplus that would be above W star, below the demand curve, and bounded by the quantity, such that our employer surplus would be the entirety of this area. Remember that an employer is a consumer of labor in a marketplace, so this is not unlike consumer surplus in other labor economics, and we've talked in prior modules and segments about employer surplus. Further, if we were reliant upon labor supply and labor demand and this equilibrium market clearing, we would have a worker surplus that would be the area below the W star, above labor supply, and bounded by the quantity. So we would have this triangle. And there is no deadweight loss. Well, in this case, if that's our situation, we also have no express profit that is being generated from labor. In fact, we know that marginal revenue product is certainly equal to the marginal expense of labor, but it's also then equal to the wage, such that marginal expense of labor is equal to the wage, and we have a profit maximizing condition. Maximizing condition. Well, in a monopsony, we know that firms are wage makers rather than wage takers. And I say wage maker, not wage setter, because they don't expressly set the wage. They make the wage based upon setting the quantity of labor they're going to hire. And they set the quantity of labor they're going to hire based upon this concept of marginal cost and marginal revenue. So here we have cleaned our model up a little bit. We see that marginal expense of labor and the marginal revenue product of labor are at their closest point of the quantity of labor of 20. We saw that in the table that we formed in the prior segment. We know that's not exactly where they would have been equal to each other. They would have been equal to each other at this point here, but based upon the table values we saw, quantity of labor of 20 was as close as we could get to marginal revenue product being equal to marginal expense of labor without marginal revenue product being less than. You never want to design your revenue to be less than your expenditures, because when you do that, you design a loss. In designing a loss, you may as well be designing your way into bankruptcy. It is that serious a problem for a firm. So when we're at this point, we know that we had a marginal revenue product of labor at 14, marginal expense of labor at 11. We might have seen a W star of 10 had there been equilibrium in the market, but moreover, we saw a wage that we would have to pay the workers in this monopsony environment of 8. That's a significant difference, a productivity of 13.4 versus a wage of 8, which means the marginal product here is $5.4 per unit. So we talked about this a moment ago in the prior segment in terms of the worker surplus and the employer surplus. In this case, we see that our employer surplus has gotten significantly smaller in terms of the surplus itself, but don't let that fool you. The surplus that the firm really wants, that the employer really wants, is profit. So yes, we might be looking at a employer surplus that is smaller, but we now have profit, and profit trumps surplus any day of the week. What we also see, though, is that we have a significantly lower worker surplus. This area here, below that which is being paid to the worker, above the supply curve. And in this case, we see that this is all a function of this limiting quantity of labor being hired in this market because of the monopsony employer calling these shots. You don't expressly see a labor-demand relationship here. We do have marginal revenue product of labor, and we know from other discussions the marginal revenue product of labor in a competitive market is going to be the same thing as labor demand, but this isn't a competitive market. So maybe it's not the exact same thing as labor demand. So some of these values, some of these relationships may run a little bit askew. More importantly, we just don't have W star. We have a smaller worker surplus, a much larger surplus and profit going to the employer, and this is then yielding some deadweight loss for the market as a whole. And deadweight loss is always a problem. Deadweight loss means that there's some value that could have been received by producers and consumers jointly in this market that's not being received. So where this firm might be expressly profiting on the marginal basis, they're giving something up. And what they're giving up is some opportunity for themselves, and they're giving up some opportunity for their workers. And in this case, they are less concerned about, less interested in the workers. If we think about this profit, this difference between what they're earning and what they're paying is express benefit to the firm. But what about this concept of mobility costs? I indicated that mobility, or costly mobility, is probably the motivator for or driver for monopsony. If it was cost less to be mobile, then a firm would never be able to have a monopsony. A worker in a monopsony situation could very easily pull and go to a new market and where there are numerous buyers of their type of labor and remove themselves from this monopsony environment. If there was perfect mobility, we would see that firms would move into that market, perhaps, and create competition for those types of workers. So when we don't have perfect mobility, where we have costly mobility, we often see a monopsony structure begin to emerge. And excuse me. And in this case, that monopsony structure yields a difference between W star and the WM, and that probably is our mobility cost. So in this case, 10 minus 8, or 2, being our mobility cost. When we have a mobility cost, we know that in this case the worker is preferring to stay where they are, suffer a lower wage, because we know that it would cost them at least 2 to be mobile. In fact, it wouldn't only cost them $2 or $2 a unit. It would cost them that wage, plus they'd be giving up what we already referred to as their psychic benefits, their psychic utility, which isn't psychic in terms of seeing a psychic or a soothsayer, psychic in terms of social, psychic in terms of those things that are soothing, those things that are comfortable to us, those things that are memorable to us. Leave our friends, leave our home, leave our family, leave the physical or geographic or climatic conditions that we enjoy. So whenever we think about monopsony in the labor market, we're thinking about a primary purchaser of labor, and we're thinking about labor as not being able to easily or inexpensively escape that market. Otherwise, it would escape into another market in which there were numerous buyers of labor. Labor would earn a higher wage. There would be a greater balance between employer surplus and worker surplus. There would not be a deadweight loss. We'd have more people employed, and we would have them employed at a higher value. We would have a higher societal value from the labor experience. We have to remember that all firms that receive any kind of marginal profit on labor, which, let's face it, is most firms, otherwise they wouldn't stay in business, all of those firms have some limited monopsony power. And that's because in all cases there's at least some limited mobility cost. Monopsony and mobility go hand in hand in thinking about them as imperfect market influences. And again, this just helps us understand something of why different workers receive different wages.